Let's take a look at this question. Here we want to write a program to find the sum of these following terms. If you look at the series, we're starting at 2 and we're just finding the sum of the factorials of all even terms from 2. So if we start at 2, we're finding 2 factorial plus 4 factorial plus 6 factorial plus 8 factorial plus 10 factorial till some nth term. Here n is actually equal to the number of terms, and we're going to take n as input from the user. So if the user enters something like 5 for n, it means that we're finding the sum of 5 terms. So then the sum, since we're going to start at 2, is going to start at 2 factorial. Since it's the sum of even terms, the next term is going to be 4 factorial. These are 2 terms. After this, our third term is going to be the factorial of the next even number. After 4, the next even number is 6. So we're going to add 6 factorial. These are 3 terms. Finally, we're going to add 8 factorial. This is our 4th term. And then 10 factorial, which is our 5th term. You can see that if the user enters 5, we're going to find the sum of 5 terms. Before we write this program, let's identify exactly what we need to do. As we can see in the question, we want to take n as input from the user. So the first step is obviously going to be to take n as input. This will be the number of terms of this series. Then we're going to take each term of the series using a loop. As we've seen before, when we use a series, we're going to take the first term using our iterator. In the next iteration of the loop, we're going to take our second term, and in the iteration after that, we're going to take our third term. And that's exactly what I meant over here. We're going to take each term of the series using a loop. Now here, we're not just adding these terms, we're adding the factorials of these terms. So for each of these terms, we need to find the factorial of each term. And since we want to find the sum of this series, we're going to add the factorial of the term to a variable like sum. You can name this however you want. I usually use sum so that it's obvious what the variable is doing. Finally, once we find the sum of the series, we'll just need to display the sum of the series. We're going to start with our first step where we're going to take n as input. And to take n as input, I'm just going to create an object of the scanner class. Let's just call this SA. And once I make this object, I'm going to ask the user to enter n. Once the user enters n, I need to store it in a variable. So I'm going to make a variable called n of the int data type, and I'm going to set this equal to sa.nextInt. Whatever the user enters, I'm going to use the nextInt method to store that in this variable n. And with that, we're done with our first step. We took n as input from the user. Now we need to find the sum of the series. If you look at our original series again, we can see that if the user enters n as 5, in that case, we're finding the sum of 5 terms. So here, 2 factorial would be our first term. 4 factorial would be the second term. 6 factorial would be the third term. 8 factorial would be the fourth term. And finally, 10 factorial would be the fifth term. If I consider my iterator I as 1 initially, you notice that my iterator I is going to be increasing by 1. In the second iteration, or in the second time we execute the loop, I is going to be 2. So we're going to be finding the second term. In the third iteration, I is going to be 3. It's going to increase by 1. And we're going to be finding the third term. As we keep doing this, we're going to get the fourth term. And finally, we're going to get the fifth term. When we reach the fifth term, we need to stop executing the loop. So we're going to say that we're going to keep executing the loop as long as I is lesser than or equal to n. If you start I at 1, this basically means that our series is going to have an n number of terms. And since we're increasing the value of I by 1, it also means that the update is going to just increase I by 1. We have our iterator, we have our update, and we also have our condition. Using all of these three things, I can make a loop where every single iteration or every single time we execute the loop, the value of I is the term we want to add. If I is 3, we're adding the third term, that's 6 factorial. When I is 5, we're adding the fifth term, we're adding 10 factorial. When I is n, we're going to add the nth term, and after that we're going to stop executing the loop. We can control the number of times we want to execute the loop, and we can make sure that we only add n terms to find a sum of the series. And now let's actually create this loop. I'll just use a for loop here. In my for loop, I'm going to first initialize my iterator I to 1. And then in my condition, I'm going to keep executing this loop as long as I is lesser than or equal to n. So we're going to have an n number of terms. That's exactly what the question wants us to do as well. Since we're going to increase I by 1, we're just going to write I++. And like I've already told you before, using this loop, we can see that when I is 1, we should be adding the first term, which is going to be 2 factorial. When I is 2, so when I increments from 1 to 2, we're going to be adding the second term, which is going to be 4 factorial. And then when I is 3, we're going to be adding the third term, which is 6 factorial. When I is 4, we're going to be adding 8 factorial. And when I is 5, we're going to be adding our fifth term, and that's going to be 10 factorial. You notice a common pattern over here. In every single iteration, this value that we're finding the factorial of is twice the value of I. So here, if you notice that when I is 3, we're finding 6 factorial. 6 is twice the value of I. When I is 5, we're not finding 5 factorial, we're finding 10 factorial. And 10 is twice the value of 5. So in my loop, when I want to find a factorial of a number, I'm not going to find a factorial of I, I'm going to find a factorial of twice the value of I. So here, I'm just going to make a variable called temp, and I'll set this to I times 2. Basically, when I is 1, the temp variable is going to be 2. So I can just find the factorial of this temp variable. I can find 2 factorial and add it to our series. When I is 2, our temp variable is going to be twice of 2. It's going to be 4. So using our program, I can find a factorial of temp, which is going to be 4 factorial, and I can add that to the series. When I is 3, temp is going to be 2 times 3. It's going to be 6. So now we're going to be finding 6 factorial, and then we're going to add this to our series. And by now, we're done with the first part of our second step. We took each term of the series using this loop, and we just need to find the factorial of each of these terms. Here we need to find a factorial of temp. We already know how to find a factorial. That's pretty simple. The first thing I need to do is I need to make a variable called factorial, and I need to initialize this to 1. This is going to be storing the factorial. Here I'm just going to use a for loop. In my for loop, since I already used I as my iterator over here, I'm going to use a different iterator. Maybe we'll use something like j. So here I'm going to use j in this for loop, and I'll initialize this to temp. Then in our condition, I'm going to keep executing this loop as long as j is greater than or equal to 1. And then we have our update as j minus minus. We already know that if you want to find a factorial, I just need to multiply j with this variable factorial. So factorial is going to be equal to factorial times j. Every single iteration, when we multiply factorial with j, we're going to find the total factorial of the number. By the end, this variable factorial is going to store the factorial of the number. Here, we're done with this step as well. We created the loop to find a factorial of each of these terms. If I is 2, temp is going to be 4, and this loop over here is going to find 4 factorial, which will be stored in this variable factorial. Now, I'll need to add the factorial of the term to a variable sum. If I want to make this variable sum, I'll have to make it outside this for loop. If I make this variable sum inside my for loop and I initialize it to 0, in this case, it's just going to keep resetting this variable sum to 0. I'll have to keep adding values to this variable sum. So I'll have to initialize it outside this for loop. So let me just add that over here. After this for loop, since we know the factorial of that number, we're going to add every term to this variable sum. Here, using this loop, we can find the factorial of temp. And after that, I need to add this factorial or this value to this variable sum. So I'm just going to say sum is equal to sum plus factorial. So as you can see, when I is 1 and temp is 2, we're going to find 2 factorial using the loop, and we're going to add it to this variable sum using this line of code. Then in our next iteration, when I is 2 and temp is 4, we're going to find 4 factorial, and we're going to add 4 factorial to this variable sum. As you can see that once we complete iterating this entire loop, we're going to find a sum of all the terms. So by the end, once we're done with this loop, the variable sum is going to store the sum of all the terms. So we can just print the variable sum. I'm going to print sum is the sum of all the terms. And with that, we're done with our second step and our third step. Let's just run this program. And let's enter n as something simple like 3. Before we click enter, let's just try to predict what the output is going to be. When n is 3, this means that we're going to add 3 terms. So the sum is going to be adding 2 factorial plus 4 factorial plus 6 factorial. 2 factorial is just 2, 4 factorial is just 24, and 6 factorial is just 720. So the sum of all these terms is just going to be 746. Where n is 3, the value of sum is going to be 746. And here, when I click enter, it's just going to print that 746 is the sum of all the terms. This was exactly what we predicted. So our program works perfectly well.